public is something that I would have to preserve.
Mr. President, other than being critical of the Cubans and the Russians for their involvement in Africa, what can this government do specifically to discourage any further involvement in the future? And specifically, have you made a decision about any possible retaliatory action against the Cubans in the way of trade or travel restrictions, or against the Soviet Union because of the recent activities in Africa?
No, I don't contemplate any retaliatory action. As you know, we have a trade embargo against Cuba at this time, and we do not have diplomatic relations with Cuba. We do have a representative in Washington and in Havana that provides just communication services, nothing else. Then acting in a way to acquaint the world with their actions, the only other thing that we can do is through peaceful means to provide some strength to nations that do want to be autonomous, that do want to see African problems settled by African people themselves. And we provide a limited amount for economic aid, some limited military aid on occasion. The other thing that we are trying to do is to involve multinational organizations to help in controlling outside intrusion into Africa. The Organization of African Unity is a good organization, but it's been relatively reluctant in the past to deal with very controversial issues. And quite often the African nations themselves are divided on controversial issues. The United Nations is one to whom we have turned, and we are working under the auspices of the United Nations in trying to deal with the Namibian question. I think you know that in Rhodesia and Namibia, we are working with other countries trying to bring about majority rule and a peaceful settlement. We have had no help at all from either the Cubans or the Soviets in trying to deal with these very sensitive questions. So I think these brief things that I've outlined are some of the things short of armed involvement, which we do not intend to do, to bring about some lessening of the Cuban-Soviet intrusion into Africa. Go ahead.
President Nyeri has been critical.
Say are eliminated, I intend to veto it. And now I'd like to recognize Ms. Thomas.
President, do you think that Fidel Castro is lying when he says that there's been no Cuban involvement in the recent invasion of Zaire? And since you made the charge, contrary to Castro's word, do you have proof that he did not attempt to restrain the rebels?
I don't really desire to get into a public dispute with Mr. Castro through the news media that Castro could have done much more had he genuinely wanted to stop the invasion. He could have interceded with the Katangans themselves. He could certainly have imposed Cuban troops near the border because they are spread throughout Angola to impede the invasion. He could have notified the Zambian government of this fact. He could have notified the Organization of African Unity. He could have notified the world at large that an invasion designed to cross and to disturb an international border was in prospect, and he did not do any of these things. At the present time, Mr. Castro has still not condemned the invasion of Zaire by the Katangan rebels. So there is no doubt in my mind that just on the basis of these facts alone, my statement is true. Rather than look backward, I would like very much for Mr. Castro to pledge himself and for the Neto government in Angola to pledge themselves to prevent any further crossing of the Angolan border, which would permit future invasions of Zaire. And of course, we would also relish the withdrawal of Cuban troops in the future, both there and Ethiopia, and support for the American, British, and other efforts to bring about peace in the southern part of Africa.
Would you be willing to see him on that subject?
No, I don't.
Well,
Cubans for their involvement in Africa. Fidel Castro has said the United States is trying to perpetrate a big lie about his involvement in Africa. Here now is the President, a number of topics, and an opening statement.
I have two brief statements to make before I answer questions.
In any event, only upon the joint request of those affected states. Requests for assistance will be examined on a case-by-case basis. Should the United States decide to provide assistance, the form it takes will necessarily be tailored to the geophysical, military, and political circumstances in the affected region. The specific services the United States would be prepared to consider providing would include the following. First, provision of land-based sensors to monitor movements in potential invasion routes and staging areas, as well as across borders. The United States has extensive experience with a wide variety of passive and active sensors. The particular mix of devices most appropriate for a specific mission will depend primarily on the physical environment in which the equipment must work, but appropriate systems can be fashioned for most physical conditions on Earth, including a wide range of terrains and climates. As a group, these land-based sensors are robust, highly sensitive, and easily monitored. For maximum effectiveness, the techniques they employ require clearly demarcated and preferably uninhabited no man's land, as well as an international inspection team to investigate suspicious or ambiguous evidence. In particular cases, this team might be provided by the United Nations or by regional organizations. Over the long run, a limited number of on-the-spot technicians would also be required to maintain the equipment. Second, assistance with aircraft photo reconnaissance and associated photo interpretation. Where such reconnaissance is intended to verify compliance with agreed force limitations, the limitation should be defined so as to be readily monitorable. For example, tanks and artillery are easily identifiable, but verifying numbers of troops is provided more difficult in the Sinai experience. In some circumstances, it might prove desirable to establish joint facilities for locally based photo interpretation that would bring together technicians from the requesting organization or affected states, as well as U.S. technical advisors. Such a program could lower costs and increase mutual confidence. Adequate training could be provided in roughly 60 to 90 days. Appropriate cost sharing by concerned parties, including the United States, will be arranged on a case-by-case basis. While the United States is ready to entertain requests for services of the sort I have described, we recognize the limitations. They are not a panacea. They cannot replace political will and negotiating flexibility, which must lie at the heart of effective arms control. Their applicability in any given situation will depend on the political, military context, as well as the physical environment. Verification of arms control agreements, whether using advanced technology.
Furthermore, le nombre des vecteurs nucléaires détenus et dans le domaine des armes conventionnelles, les quantités de certains matériels considérés comme représentatifs de l'effort militaire. Ainsi, les contributaires seraient les États les plus riches et les plus armés. Pour examiner les différentes questions liées à la création de ce fonds, la France propose que soit institué un groupe d'experts au sein desquels elle se réserve la possibilité de compléter ses propositions. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Doy las gracias al distinguido representante de Francia. Tiene ahora la palabra el